everybody knows the Mississippi River. And when they get here and they see it and they know it's open to the public and you can actually enjoy it, I think that's a really compounding thing that has really impactful on me to see, especially our international visitors, and how this place has that impact on them as well.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 41 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Well, we've got a busy stretch here coming up as we start to slide into summer, and it certainly feels like summer here today as I'm recording this in St. Louis on Sunday, May 19th. It's already about 90 degrees, so looks like we're probably in for a long, hot summer this year. So what better time than to get out and enjoy some outdoor time along the Mississippi River? And I've got a couple of books now that you can take with you that are freshly updated or brand new, hot off the presses. This week, my natural history guide, The Wild Mississippi, a state-by-state guide to the river's natural wonders, releases officially on Tuesday, May 21. So you can find it anywhere books are sold. Go to your favorite bookstore, order a copy there, however you prefer to get your books. I also just published the third edition of my Road Tripping the Great River Road book, the guide for the upper half of the Mississippi River. Freshly revised and updated. I think you'll find that a good companion to The Wild Mississippi. The Wild Mississippi focuses on the outdoors experiences, while Road Tripping really focuses on the experiences of driving along the river, so an emphasis on museums and cultural sites and where to eat and stay. So a good pair of books to have. Well, in this episode, we're not going to talk about those books. We're going to talk about something else that's a big deal this year. This year marks the 100th anniversary, the centennial, of the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. In this episode, I talk with Sabrina Chandler and Hallie Shulz from the Refuge. Sabrina Chandler is the Refuge manager, and Hallie Shulz is the visitor services manager. And we have a nice conversation really going over the broad history of the Refuge itself. So we talk a little bit about those early years and some of the work that had to be done to establish the Refuge in the first place, the conservation mission of the Refuge and how that's changed over time, the help they get from the various friends groups along the river that provide critical support, how public use has grown and changed over time, and some of the challenges facing the refuge in the future from things like climate change and invasive species. If you have any doubts about the importance of refuge lands, just take a look at what the Mississippi River looks like in the 261 miles from Wabasha down to about Rock Island, and then go south of the Quad Cities and take a look at what the river is like. The refuge has preserved a tremendous amount of habitat and backwater habitats. Hasn't been easy, but it's provided a legacy for future generations to still be able to connect to and enjoy the river. There are a lot of events going on this year to mark the centennial, and I'll include a link in the show notes to a website that is tracking all of that. The refuge itself, they have some events they host directly, and one of them coming up is June 22nd at the Visitor Center in Bryce Prairie. You can go to the Refuge website or the link in the show notes to find out more about that event and all the other things going on, and maybe I will see you there. Thanks to all of you who show me some love through Patreon. Your support keeps this podcast alive, and I'm extremely grateful for that. If you want to know how to join the Patreon community, go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg, One of the benefits is early access to this podcast. Patreon supporters get to listen a couple days before everybody else. If Patreon's not your thing, but you'd still like to show a little support, well, you can buy me a coffee. So go to my website, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and there you'll find instructions on how to buy me a coffee and support my caffeine habit. And you can also use that same address to get to the show notes, maybe even leave a comment on an episode. Well, let's get on with the interviews. Sabrina Chandler is the refuge manager of the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge and an area supervisor over refuges on the Upper Mississippi, Illinois, and Missouri rivers. Sabrina began that role in 2014 after serving as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, Sabrina worked on refuges in Arkansas, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia. She's worked for the service for more than 22 years, and she and her family now live in Trempealeau, Wisconsin, really close to the refuge. Hallie Shulz has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 20 years as a refuge ranger at various sites and has been with the Upper Miss River Refuge for 8 years. Her passion is all about connecting visitors with the resource and encouraging recreation on our public lands. Sabrina and Hallie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, Dean.
Well, it's such a pleasure to have you now, especially, the centennial celebrations are already in full swing. I've been to one already in Lansing and hope to get to at least one more before it's all said and done. I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a little bit of the past, present, and future kind of format when we talk about the refuge. And maybe the place to start, one thing I was curious about, when a new refuge is created, when this refuge was created 100 years ago, what did they have to do to even get this started? What were the first tasks that the early refuge managers had to tackle? And I don't know, Hallie or whoever wants to handle that first, just jump right in.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, Dean. I think, once the refuge was established, that was an entire process in itself. Will Dilg and a number of his friends and colleagues were really forward-looking in a way that helped us have the Upper Miss Refuge, and it was established through an act of Congress. So once that was done, typically when refuges are established through Congress, there's some direction that Congress gives with that authorization. And so in this case, Congress wanted the states to be involved before any land acquisition occurred. And so in June of 1924, June 7th, 1924, when the law was signed by Calvin Coolidge, we started, with the process of kind of following Congress's direction. And so the first thing that had to happen was to get the consent from the states for the land acquisition. So I think the first managers would have really started on that right away. And in 1925, they were able to get all of the consent from the states, and Congress allocated $1.5 million for land acquisition in 1925. That's a lot of money. And so then their next task was to get to work purchasing land. So first couple of years, they were able to use that $1.5 million and acquired about 90,000 acres. And then the War Department came in and established the navigation channel, and that was in 1930. And the Corps of Engineers started acquiring land. And at that point, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided, or what was then the Biological Survey, decided that it was going to be too confusing for two agencies to start acquiring land. And the Fish and Wildlife Service kind of took a back seat to the land acquisition aspect, and the Corps took the lead on that to acquire the lands they needed for the navigation project. So land acquisition was really all of the efforts up front, and then slowly started transitioning into the habitat side of things.
So in the beginning, there was the vision really included a wide range of public uses. Could you just kind of speak to a little bit about how Congress and Will Dilg envisioned what the refuge would be like and who would have access to it and what it would be for?
Yeah, they did really have a multi-use approach, just trying to make sure that that you had the conservation aspect, but also the recreation. They recognized the value of recreation. Will Dilg himself used the river for recreation. He was an avid bass fisherman, and they wanted to make sure that that continued, and recognizing that, sportsmen at the time were really our best conservationists. And so they wanted to make sure that that was priority, and that was written into the law and part of the consent with the states. Hallie has done a lot of research with some of the public use stuff, and she serves on a committee that works with the states now to continue to coordinate that recreational use.
Have the public use of it expanded at all or changed much in those 100 years?
Yeah, it sure has. We've had, I think one of the really interesting things that I hadn't put a lot of thought into before I started this 100th year anniversary adventure in learning all of the history of the refuge, is, before, World War II or whatever, there wasn't, and before vehicles and all the major roads and cars weren't as much of a thing, there wasn't as much public use in the early, 1900s as there is now, because they just didn't have access. You didn't have people coming from all over the country to use this resource. And now that's obviously just grown exponentially over time. So as you have more people, you have more public use, and obviously uses change too. So I think that's another thing that we've had to manage and try to figure out how we're going to have this as a resource for all the users while still maintaining that conservation mission. Because I always come back to, this is public land, it is your refuge, and we want to be able to have the public use happen on this refuge, but we also have to manage for the resource. And so there's always that balance of trying to and then the balance of managing the different user groups of the refuge, which is always a game too, where you have to make sure that you've got, you're looking at the different seasons of fishing and hunting and migration, and just making sure that you don't have too much conflict in the user groups so that everybody has a good experience. So that's, there's a lot that goes into that. So
that's quite a juggling act.
It's, you know what it is, Dean? It's job security for me. But I love, the reason I do what I do is because I love to see people enjoying their public land and the outdoors. And I always say, if people don't go out and use it and appreciate it, they're never going to want to protect it. I mean, that's the whole reason we have this refuge today, is because the Isaac Walton League and Will Dilg and the people that really used it and were out there and loved the river, they were the ones that protected it to continue to be a resource for us today.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, so back 100 years ago, then you raised the point I didn't think much about. Like, people had very different transportation options, and there were probably a lot fewer visitors in those early years to the refuge. So who was really using the refuge at that time 100 years ago, and in the first decade or so?
I mean, I think the majority of the users were probably fishermen, maybe some recreational boating, not probably too much of that. Hunters, and I'm sure obviously wildlife observation has been a thing forever, so I'm sure that was a use out there too. But I think that those were probably two of our biggest uses. And like Sabrina said, they were our early conservationists. They were the voice for a lot of our natural resources that we have. So they're very, very important uses today still.
I think too, there was probably a lot of what we would maybe consider today subsistence uses. So, people were putting food on their tables because of their use of the refuge. And a lot of those folks were local, but, Will Dilg himself lived in Chicago, and he would, recognize the value of nature and getting away from those big cities and getting out into our public lands or into the wild places at that time before it was public land. and enjoying that in a very different way than we do now. I think technology has definitely changed our user groups, even in the common day. We've seen a tremendous increase in visitation over the last 10 years because of things like this podcast, getting the word out to folks. Hunters come out and film their hunting adventures or their fishing adventures, and they're streaming it on YouTube, and people are seeing it across the country, and they're coming here because they're learning about, the folks that are using it locally. And we do see a very broad range of visitors and folks that just want to dip their toes into the river because they're here from Germany visiting friends. And that's such a big thing in the international community. Everybody knows the Mississippi River. And when they get here and they see it and they know it's open to the public and you can actually enjoy it, I think that's a really compounding thing that has really, it's been really impactful on me to see, especially our international visitors, and how this place has that impact on them as well.
Yeah. It's such an iconic river. Like people around the world, especially Germany and Japan, especially, I think because of the associate with American soldiers carrying American culture to those countries in World War II. Those seem to be hotbeds for interest in the Mississippi, is from what I've figured out too.
Yeah.
Let's dig into just a little bit the conservation side of your vision of your management. When the refuge was created 100 years ago, what was the state of the river at that time?
It was a pretty wild place. John Infanson is a very well-known historian and author. He wrote the book, The River We Have Wrought. And John does a really good job of describing just the treacherous nature even of the river at that time. The backwaters were a little more open and more wild, and the main channel, very much like your background there, lots of stumps and trees and things like that, shallow sandbars. Now with the navigation channel, it's a very, very different place. And so early on, you had more of that naturally dynamic floodplain that, the floodplain would consume the river as it grew through snow melt or rainfall, and then it would go back to its navigation or its original channel. With the navigation, we have pretty much a floodplain that's filled all of the time with the pool system. And so we don't have those naturally occurring floodplain processes. And so, it's a very different place than it was then, but each also still carries some pretty tremendous value for conservation.
I think one of the things I think about if I was, on the Mississippi 100 years ago, there were places that you could walk across it, which I think is pretty crazy to think about. Like, I'm just gonna walk across the Mississippi River right now.
Yeah, I'm in Wabasha. I think I'll just walk across the river to Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
It would also make it really hard though to be in a boat, because if you hit something that shallow, you can't.
Yeah. And of course, as you said, the river was dynamic. So I think that tended to be more late summer when the river was especially low. And I don't think it was every year it was low enough to walk across. There were variations in that.
Yeah.
And usually there'd be a little bit of a rise again in the fall as we get a little bit more rain. Now, I know Big River Magazine has a really good issue out right now looking at the centennial, and some really nice articles looking at the refuge in 25-year segments. And I would just like to touch on a couple of issues that came up with that. Like, I know, when the lock and dam system was built, it dramatically changed the ecology of that part of the river. And when the refuge legislation was passed, there was a carve out for future navigation projects, essentially. Apparently it would not have passed without that carve out. So when we built the locks and dams, though, that had a dramatic effect on the river. And it seems like for the first 20 or so years, there were some pretty strong ecological benefits, and some aspects of the refuge were thriving. Can you just say a little bit about what was going on at that point in time, or what you know about that point in time, and that brief period when the river seemed to really be shining and doing well?
Yeah, immediately after the construction of some of the earlier locks and dams, as I mentioned earlier, the floodplain was basically filled. So it enhanced the backwaters. It enhanced all of those areas that we could access. It opened up new areas of inundated backwaters for the critters to enjoy. And so it basically, started from scratch in a lot of ways. I mean, I like to point to Pool 7, Lake Onalaska, that was a hayfield before the lock and dam system. And now it's a big lake and one of the, premier spots for some of our fisheries. And over time, we've kind of seen that degrade just as habitats evolve through successional phases. But that initial productivity that occurred from that expansion of that floodplain system and the inundation of it pretty much year round, it definitely had some major productivity and gave a lot of opportunity for habitats to really thrive, or critters to thrive in those habitats.
Right.
I
And then
think
over time, go ahead, Hallie.
Oh, I was gonna say, didn't before the lack and dance system, when it did dry out so much, didn't they? Wasn't one of the biggest things they did was like fish rescues so that they wouldn't dry out, and that was one of their first management things was we got to save all the fish and move them into where they're going to be able to stay in water so they don't all die. And I think one of the ways they tried to manage for that was blowing up some of the riverbanks to allow water flow into some of those areas, which I thought was really interesting. So, yeah, kind of crazy.
I'm going to guess that part of your day-to-day responsibilities today do not include blowing up any riverbanks, but maybe I'm
You'd
wrong.
be surprised, Dean. You'd be surprised.
Yeah.
So there was some decline in habitat productivity, especially after the 60s. And then there was a period kind of in the late 80s and early 90s when there were some really concerning problems that happened, some ecosystem collapse in some places. Can you kind of describe a little bit about what happened at that time and what do we think was going on?
Yeah. So specifically to the collapse there in the late 70s, 80s timeframe, I think there was a lot going on with the surrounding land uses, the sedimentation from farming practices. There weren't the conservation practices that we have today that conserve the soils on site as well as they do now. So we had a lot of sedimentation that was occurring from those surrounding land uses. And then we had that compounded by the removal of that sedimentation from the navigation channel. And at the time, the common practice for the Corps was to pump that material into the backwaters, or what we call thalweg placement, where they would just put it in the edge of the channel and let it go wherever the water took it. And so I think that combined with, just like I mentioned earlier, that natural succession that we see in habitats, the degradation over time of certain habitats transitioning into earlier or later successional phases. But it really was a combination of factors, and a lot of it really was compounded by that surrounding land use and the dredging practices of the Corps. The states weren't really happy about that and got very heavily engaged, and there was even some litigation that occurred, and there was a big study, the GREAT study, and that's an acronym. The biggest thing that really came out of that was the ability for all of the states and the federal agencies to partner on a solution. And in 1986, the Water Resources Development Act that year came out with the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program being established. And that really was a significant turning point for not only the refuge, but also for the Upper Mississippi River Basin. So that really changed things. Because of all of that degradation, it was recognized that we didn't do something soon, that we would lose that opportunity to have those backwater habitats that everything depends on. So that was the biggest thing.
All right. So sedimentation is still a concern. the dams still trap a lot of sediment behind them, and there are some areas that have filled in substantially over time, like with the long lens of time. What are the guiding principles for the conservation mission of the refuge today?
So the refuge specifically, obviously over time, the original establishment was prior to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then once the Fish and Wildlife Service was established and the Department of Interior kind of took over sole management of the refuge, things did change quite dramatically because it was managed as part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And then in 1997, the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act was passed, and that gave us some very clear guidance on how the refuge would be managed with regard to not only our natural resource management, but also with our recreation and public uses. And so we're bound by law in a lot of ways, and so that statutory requirement drives a lot of our conservation principles in itself. But beyond that, the partnership that we have here on the river is really honestly like no other. I've had the good fortune to work all over the country, and I've worked with the Corps of Engineers in a lot of places, and we have a very special partnership here with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps of Engineers and our 4 states where the refuge occurs: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and then expanded into the full upper Mississippi River Basin, which includes Missouri, where we also have national wildlife refuges beyond the upper Miss Refuge proper. And so that partnership of folks really help drive those conservation principles together. And so we try to work on those things, not only because we're required to from a statutory purpose, but also because we can make sure that we can leverage relationships and resources. And, nobody ever has enough time and money, but together we can do a lot of great things. And those conservation principles, really making sure that we're protecting this habitat in long term, in perpetuity, but making sure that it's thriving and that it's beneficial to the resources, and that includes the people who use it.
Mm-hmm. There are, as you alluded to, there's so many hands involved with the Mississippi. A lot of different agencies have some role in managing some part of it or some aspect of it. So you can't, you don't operate in a vacuum. You can't just decide we're going to do this today and just go out and do it. You have to have all the negotiations and discussions with all these various partners. So, and I know, like, you don't have a bottomless pit of money to work with to fund the refuge. So when it comes to, let's just say on the conservation side, when it comes to deciding where to focus your time and energy for specific projects, how do you decide where to put your limited resources into? What drives those decisions about which projects you really want to focus on?
That's $1 million question.
All right, I'll take a check. No.
Yeah, that's something that we really struggle with, because we have a lot of pressure, both from the public and then just the needs of the system, the partnership. And as you mentioned, we don't have that bottomless pit of bankroll, but the way that we really focus on the priority is where we can move the needle the most. Sometimes that's not always possible, and it's more of the squeaky wheel, but we try to be as realistic as possible with making those tough decisions on invasive species, for example. They're always going to be there. There's always new ones coming in, and sometimes we have to take a triage approach and say, okay, what, this one's pretty much naturalized. We're going to just kind of accept that, and we're going to really focus on some of these new invaders that are coming in that are having a more significant impact. And so it's kind of a mixed bag, and it really depends on what the issue is. And sometimes we're told, we're government employees, and we serve at the request of the administration, and sometimes they have priorities that'll shift our workload and how we focus our efforts here as well. So there's a combination of things that happen there.
It's
I
very
was gonna
difficult work.
say,
Yeah,
I
go
was
ahead,
gonna
Hallie.
say, one of the great things about working for this agency is that the people are very passionate about what they do and are willing to put in the work. And you don't hear people complaining. They just they want to do good work. And like Sabrina said, we are really fortunate that we can leverage partnerships and volunteers and all of the other really passionate people that work and live along the river. So, we do rely on those partners and our friends groups and all of the volunteers to assist us with all of the work that comes into conserving this. And so I want to point that out, that we do have some assistance from those kinds of people too, and we are very fortunate for that.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystems supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold. Yeah, I was going to ask about the friends groups too. Like, do you want to just describe a little bit about who they are and what the kind of help they provide for the refuge?
Yeah, so the Upper Miss Refuge, just kind of a quick overview on how it works. Since the refuge is so long, it's 261 miles long, we are split into 4 management districts. So those districts are based on the pools. So, Winona District is the furthest north district, and they manage essentially they manage pools 4 through 6. La Crosse is 7 and 8, La Crosse District, and then you've got McGregor District, and then you have a Savannah District. So each district has its own office in it, and each district also has its own friends group. So, so that's really cool because we basically have 4 friends groups, and then we also have the Friends of the Upper Mississippi River, who work a lot with our fisheries, which is a whole nother kind of branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we do have a lot of support from those groups, and one of the biggest things that they do is they can lobby for things. They're a nonprofit, so we obviously as government employees can't do that. They also, they can raise money and funding for projects that we might not otherwise be able to get. So I'm sure Sabrina could probably add to that, but
the biggest thing I think is
yeah.
they're advocates for the refuge, and they do that in a lot of ways. So we really couldn't do what we do without our friends groups and our volunteers, for sure. Hallie's absolutely right with that.
Yeah, and I was in Lansing in February for the Friends of Pool 9 event for the centennial, watching Stephen Marking doing his show on Will Dilg. And in fact, I had Stephen Marking on the podcast to talk about Will Dilg a few weeks ago. They're a big group. There are a lot of people who are involved in helping out. I was impressed with the number of people they have involved. And I'm sure some of them also, you maybe are available for volunteer hours if you need help for a day to pull purple loosestrife or whatever invasive you want to tackle on a particular place.
Yeah, I think the last number I heard for membership for Friends of Pool 9, like 800 members or something.
Yeah.
They are a passionate group, and they do an annual banquet every year that brings in a lot of folks. They have a great auction. They raise a lot of good money to do a lot of great work. They have some volunteers that collect acorns for us, and we ship those acorns to a nursery, and we grow hardwood trees to do our forest restoration. That way we have the local phenotype that can survive the flood durations and things that we see in these areas. And so the value that they bring fringe groups in general, and in particular that ongoing project that Friends of Pool 9 has supported. Yeah, you just can't place a dollar amount on that.
Absolutely. I want to so on the conservation side, I kind of want to wrap up with just talking a little bit about some of the challenges, and then we'll get into recreation a little bit more too. But I'm kind of wondering, like from your perspective today, what are some of the biggest conservation challenges that you're facing in the refuge?
Besides the one that we've already talked about, not having enough people and money, the biggest one really is climate change. That's really driving so much change in the system. It's compounding all of the factors that we struggle with on a bigger scale. The flooding, inundation, and duration is changing. We're also seeing extremes with drought. So just the polar opposites that are occurring, the extremes on either end instead of more that moderate level activity. We've been in a couple of years of drought, which I think in 2019, none of us ever could have imagined that we would be in a multi-year drought. And so, those impacts of climate change, those extreme weather events from one direction to another, really are having a significant impact on our ability to manage and predict and, just really be able to move the needle for conservation. So we're taking different approaches to our work as a result of that. In the Fish and Wildlife Service, we use a framework called Resist, Accept, and Direct, the RAD framework. Those of us that lived in the 80s know that term at a little bit of a different terminology. So we get a lot of good jokes about how rad we are these days with climate change. But
it would work on me, so.
Yeah, there you go. So climate change is one of them, and it really is changing the way that we approach our work, and trying to be more intentional, building in that resiliency, adapting to that climate change, and really just trying to anticipate where we might end up. But that's by far our biggest challenge.
Yeah, I know there's been some discussion about the health of floodplain forests in particular. It seems like after the extended high water in 2019 in particular, but not just then, a lot of trees have died back in the floodplain forest. And it's not just in the refuge. Down in my part of the river too, I see large areas where trees have died. And I think it's probably because, well, even though these are trees that are adapted to live in the floodplain and be wet for a while, they do have a limit.
Yeah.
And they can't survive beyond a certain amount of time where their feet are wet.
Yeah.
So you're seeing some of that floodplain forest loss and trying to figure out, I assume, like, do you have an idea of what you would like to be able to do to deal with some of that, or?
Yeah. The floodplain forest loss is a big impact on our habitat, just from we are one of the largest contiguous remaining floodplain forest habitats left, just by nature of our length and the size of the refuge. But yeah, climate change definitely having an impact on that habitat type. It's one of our priority resources of concern in our conservation management plans. And so we're really focusing hard and heavy on that aspect because of those impacts. So we're doing a lot of work, again, with the partnership through the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. We have a couple of habitat rehabilitation and enhancement projects that come out of that program. They're funded through the Corps of Engineers, through an allocation from Congress each year. And so we've got a number of those projects that we're actually elevating some of the landscape in the backwaters to give those trees a little bit more buffer to that high water that we see in this new normal. But we're also, restoring some of the tree species that haven't been able to regenerate on their own. So, some of the heavier mass trees that the acorns can't germinate because of the high water. And so we're actually bringing in a new approach, root production method, technique for tree restoration, where we're planting containerized seedlings so they have a little bit of a jump start. They can be more successful with those dynamic changes in their water levels. So we're doing a lot of work on that through that Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. The refuge was funded through the Inflation Reduction Act for some climate adaptation and resiliency. And we recently received some funding through that specifically for floodplain restoration throughout the system. Beyond the Upper Miss Refuge, all of our refuges on the Upper Mississippi River will receive some of that benefit. So it's a high priority. We're working really hard on that, trying to come up with new ways to be successful, but trying to combat those impacts and make sure that those floodplain forests are here for the next 100 years.
Right. You know, and I saw some of those plans too, and I imagine again partly because you've got these limited resources, the idea of elevating the floodplain will work in a handful of places, but that's not something that's necessarily going to scale up real well. You can't elevate the floodplain and the whole refuge.
Right.
Um,
And it's pretty expensive, and it takes
Yeah.
some pretty intensive engineering, and so the Corps is able to do that for us. But where we don't have the ability to utilize that Corps program with the Corps of Engineers, then yeah, we have to get a little more creative, and that's where some of those different types of seedlings come in, and we can still give them that head start and hope that they can survive.
Right. And I suppose for a little while, you know, maybe for a generation even, we just might see some islands in particular that are more grassland than forest.
Yeah, and there's a pretty common saying around here that a lot of us are doing all this work and we'll never see the benefits, and that's really hard for some people to wrap their heads around. A lot of us want to see that direct result from our work, but we don't have that in this business very often, and especially with floodplain restoration. We're talking about the next generation actually seeing the benefits of that work, and so
I was gonna say on that note, actually, Sabrina, I was thinking how cool it is that we since this has been established for 100 years now, how we as employees of the refuge have gotten to see how we've adapted and managed and made things better, and have done island restoration and have seen that those successes over time, and have actually gotten to witness that in the last 100 years. So we might not be able to be around for the next 100, but at least you get to see some of the stuff that's actually worked and been successful. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, from an institutional perspective, you do have a memory. You can look back on the projects and
Right.
and see what worked. Some of the folks who were involved in those 100 years ago, not so much. But
Yeah.
but yeah, for you, that's nice to be able to see that continuity. So we could probably talk all day on the conservation side of things, and I like to geek out on that at times too. But I just love visiting the refuge. And I live in St. Louis, as I said before we started recording. And every time I go up to La Crosse to visit friends, I'm so envious of how easy it is to access all this great backwater habitat and these areas that are so accessible. I have to drive an hour really to get to anything close to that, near like that in my area. Do you have a ballpark idea of how many people are visiting the refuge from year to year at this point?
I think we kind of estimate around 3.5 million visitors annually. That's it's hard to get real good counts of numbers. We have to use a little math and guesswork on that. But we do have, I think the reason we have such high visitation is because people are coming to the river to recreate and might not even realize that it's a refuge. It's not like if you're going to Yellowstone National Park, that that's your destination. You're going to this national park. I think a lot of our youth, they're on a national wildlife refuge and they don't realize they're on a refuge. So we have a lot of public use that are coming and using this amazing resource that we're trying to manage for the public the best way we can. And they don't even know it's a wildlife refuge. So that's one of our, I think, biggest challenges is letting people know that this is a wildlife refuge and it's part of a bigger system.
Yeah, also, you almost need to put up a station where they can put a stamp in a passport like they do for the national parks, that they've been to the
We
refuge.
have those. We do have those. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So just off the top of your head now, give me a list of the different kinds of uses, the different kinds of ways people can enjoy the refuge.
Well, okay, I'll start. Somebody can chime in. obviously, any kind of boating activity. So if you can do it by boat, people do it. Fishing, waterfowl hunting, turkey and deer hunting on the islands. We've got obviously different kinds of fishing that people do. We've got people that are just wildlife watching, people that are out kayaking, canoeing. Wildlife photography is a big thing out here. Obviously, I see some people with some really big lenses taking photos, which is whenever I see that, I'm like, what are they looking at? So I want to pull over and see what they're getting photos of. Um, we've got gosh, I mean, I feel like every year there's a new use. We have, in the wintertime, we have ice fishing. We have, people that we have trapping that happens along the river, of course. What am I missing? There's so many.
I think the big one, Hallie, that is unique to the Upper Miss that not a lot of national wildlife refuges have is camping.
Oh, sure.
We have a significant number of folks during the summertime who will find our beaches as the perfect camping spot. They'll bring their families out and they'll stay. 4th of July week is always a huge time on the refuge just from a purely recreational standpoint. Folks are swimming and camping and boating and just sunbathing on the beaches. So we typically see a significant increase in users, obviously during the summer, but especially, in those big holidays where we see those specific increases related to camping and just recreational boating. The other things that we do that we probably wouldn't think about as recreation per se, but we're still considered uses of the refuge. There's a lot of research going on here. Lots of research from universities, lots of research from the states, lots of researchers, even internationally. And so not necessarily recreation, but people are researching recreation and how that recreation is impacting the resource, why people are recreating here and what impacts that has. There's been a lot of economic studies on the uses of the refuge and how that provides economic development to the local community surrounding the refuge because of all of that recreation. So that's another point that I always like to bring up because we kind of set the bar for a lot of things because the research is centered here and that transcends to other areas as well.
Right, and I forgot you've got the U.S. Geological Survey station
Yep.
on French Island there near La Crosse, doing
Yep.
research on water quality and river
Right.
management. So yeah, there's a lot going on in that. That may be the most heavily researched part of a river anywhere in the world at this point. Huh?
It's a big part of what we do for sure. The USGS runs the long-term resource monitoring portion of the Upper Mississippi River Restoration. Their 3 focus pools in that program are all 3 on the Upper Miss Refuge, and so we benefit tremendously from that information and that long-term, now over 35 years worth of data.
So you mentioned boating. Yeah, I know. Like I'm a paddler, so I like getting out in a canoe, especially. So you've got several designated paddling trails. Can you just say something about those trails and what people can expect from them?
Yeah, we have, I think, 16 water trails on the refuge. So there's at least one in every district, multiple in all the districts. They vary in their difficulty and also seasonally. So I think one thing I always tell people when they ask about water trails on the refuge is to know what the conditions are. I don't know, just a month ago, even before we had all the rain, one of our water trails here, the Lake Onalaska water trail, was so low that you would have had to portage your canoe at every 10 feet. And now it's, definitely navigable. So obviously since the river does change and the backwaters change so much, you want to know what your route is and know your conditions. But we have some of the most beautiful trails that you can experience. You get on those trails and you feel like you're back 100 years ago. You don't see anything or hear people, and you've got great blue herons that will fly out in front of you, and the bald eagles. Oh my gosh, the bald eagles on the river. I can't believe we didn't even talk about that yet. People love the bald eagles. There's so many. There are so
So
many.
many.
Pool 9 has like over 200 active eagle nests now. I mean, it's wild. That's just pool 9. So that's a whole nother, I mean, that's a whole nother thing to talk about successes. But yeah, the
Mhm.
water trails are amazing, and I highly encourage people. Some are circular, so you don't have to get a shuttle. So there are some that have, the put in and take out is in the same location, and some are where you have to get someone to shuttle you so that you can get back to your boat. But all of them are really special in their own way, and they should be pretty well marked with our canoe trail signs. And you can find all of them on our website. I've got them all up with our directions and some of the things to expect.
Well, I can post a link to that in the show notes as well as yeah, you make it hard to get lost, so that's probably a good thing for most of us, eh? Are there, so yeah, I know like Sabrina mentioned the popularity of the river on the 4th of July and around the 4th of July. And I know summer weekends, when the weather's nice, it gets very busy out there. Do you have any tips for people, places they might be able to go to get away from some of the bigger crowds or places that might be a little less visited
Don't
within
go on 4th of July. Just
the,
kidding.
just don't go on the 4th of July.
No,
Pick
I don't
one.
know. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's just like anywhere. If you can find some of the backwaters and gems and maybe smaller towns that are those cute little quaint river towns that might not have as much use. Obviously, weekdays are going to be not as busy as weekends, and timing of the year is another thing. So just kind of looking at all of those factors can be helpful. Yeah, I don't know that I would say that there's any spot in particular that see. Now here's the thing, Dean, if I tell you and everyone's gonna know about it, and then it's not gonna be a super secret.
Maybe you can tell me when we're done recording and I'll just
No.
go there myself. So
Everybody has their favorite spot, and it
Yeah.
really does depend on what you're looking for. If you want to take a nice paddle, some of the trails are used more than others. So it really does depend. But in my opinion, and I'm clearly biased, there's no bad spot on the refuge.
yeah. So there are a couple of other refuges in the general vicinity, and I think they technically have different management, although the management may be consolidated at this point. So there's the Trempealeau National Wildlife Refuge and the Driftless Area Refuge. Can you just speak a little bit to your relationships with those refuges and what's different about them?
Yeah, sure. So administratively, those are individual refuges separate from the Upper Miss Refuge, but we manage those out of our Upper Miss district. So the Trempealeau Refuge, as the name implies, is in Trempealeau, Wisconsin, just around 9,000 acres, a little less than that. They have their own staff, but they are what we call a complex. They're part of the administrative staff of the La Crosse district of the Upper Miss. And so we share resources and staff and work together on those refuges. We mentioned earlier, we don't have enough staff and money, and so we have to really kind of make sure that we're collaborating. The Driftless area does not have its own staff or office, and it is managed out of our McGregor district office in Prairie du Chien. So those function as standalone refuges, but administratively they are managed out of our Upper Miss offices. Very unique in their own way. Driftless area was established to protect endangered species. The Talus-Salgific slopes that are protected by the acquisition of those lands that are included in the Driftless area refuge. The Iowa Pleistocene snail and the northern monkshood plant are very, very unique. landscape resources that are protected there. The Trempealeau Refuge actually used to be a fur and fish farm. And so we have some pretty active wetland management there, prairie restoration and management, very, very cool places, and definitely just as unique and valuable to conservation and this geography as the Upper Miss Refuge. So I appreciate you bringing those up.
Yeah, Trempealeau Refuge is one of my favorite spots. I know, like, I'm sure it gets plenty of visitors, but it seems like I always manage to pick a time to go when there's hardly anybody else around, and it just attracts so many birds. So it's a great spot for wildlife spotting. I've seen beaver and muskrat there as well. So I think that's really a particularly special place, and it's really easy to get to. I love that. I don't feel like I'm giving away any secrets there.
Yeah. Yeah, the access there is very different, obviously, than the Upper Miss. You can drive in; they have an auto tour loop. Yeah, it's
they've got really distinct boundaries too. I mean, that's another big difference between the Upper Miss and a lot of other refuges is that you can look at a map and say that is Trempealeau Refuge. You can see the boundary around it, whereas the Upper Miss Refuge is pieces of land and water all the way up and down 260-mile stretch. They actually had over 4,000 transactions when they were first purchasing the land, which I thought was crazy.
That is, yeah, but you're right. Like when you're traveling down the river, you're never quite sure if you're in National Wildlife Refuge or on core land or a state park or maybe even a city park. Like you could be on any one of those as you're traveling down, which makes it a little harder for folks to maybe appreciate what the refuge itself is doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned core land, and we talked about the Fish and Wildlife Service stopped purchasing land initially when the navigation system was created. The Corps of Engineers purchased another almost 110,000. I think it was actually like around 106,000 acres. We managed that as part of the National Wildlife Refuge system through a cooperative agreement with the Corps. And so a lot of the Corps of Engineers lands is actually managed as National Wildlife Refuge. So that just adds to the confusion even more.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm mindful of the time, and so we're going to kind of have to wind it down here so I don't keep up your whole day. I know you've probably got plenty of other things you need to do. You maybe need to build a cart barrier, or I don't know. You probably have lots of things going on. What are a couple of things that you would what's something that you would really like people to know about the refuge that you think more people should know?
I'll jump in there, and I know Hallie's got some ideas on this as well, but one thing that we did when we really started thinking about what it meant for us to celebrate our 100th anniversary is set some objectives, because we didn't want to just have a party. We didn't want to just say, yay, we're 100 years old. We wanted to be more intentional with our efforts surrounding that significant event. And so we had a great team of folks that included a bunch of partners and friends members and just local community folks and staff. And we set some objectives. And the first objective was to help people realize if this refuge had not been created in 1924 by some really forward-looking folks, what this area would look like today. And it would be very different. It would be levied agriculture. It would be residential areas. It would be urbanized. It would be very, very different. And so we, first of all, want folks to understand that we would be in a very different place, literally and figuratively, if the refuge had not been created. The other thing is that it is a refuge, and Hallie mentioned this earlier. We want to make sure that people understand that when they're on the Mississippi River near La Crosse, Wisconsin, or any of the other places within the refuge, that they're on public land that's managed as a system. 571 now, I think, national wildlife refuges across the country and into the Pacific and the territories. It's a system. We're all managed as part of a system, and that is pretty significant. And I think a lot of people don't realize the value that brings to our own backyards. And so that's one thing that I want people to understand and appreciate. And then third, we want people to think about kind of, where we go from here. And we, have our little logo that we had produced for this celebration. And it's significant because it says the first 100 years. And that's intentional because we want to look forward into the next 100 years and make sure that we're leaving the legacy that we're living now from Will Dilg and all of those folks in that early time. So those are the things that I just want to make sure that your listeners know and understand. And if they live in and around the refuge, or if they come to visit, that they understand just how fortunate we are that people took that time 100 years ago to work so hard to make this happen, and how fortunate we are to have this right here in our backyards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I would say that, the way that I always like to explain the importance of refuges, and this refuge, but all refuges, is I use the analogy of being on a road trip, and how when you're on a road trip, you need restaurants, you need fuel, you need gas stations for your car, you need a place to stop and sleep. And if you don't have those things, you're not going to make it very far on a road trip, especially gas for your car. And it's the exact same thing for wildlife, birds and wildlife. They need places to rest. They need places to sleep. They have to recharge. They have their favorite restaurants right here on Lake Onalaska. The canvasback's favorite food is out here. And so we get some of the biggest population of canvasbacks that stops here. The tundra swans, they love the river over by Brownsville. That's like their favorite restaurant ever. And so that you'll see them there. And I think without, this being established as a refuge and all of our other refuges, those birds on their super highway, flyway, they're not going to make it very far if they don't have those places to rest and feed and fuel up. And that's what refuges are. And that's why they're so important. So I like to use that because we all know what that is like, being on a road trip. I love asking kids that. They're like, I'm going to need my iPad. Like, what are you going to need on a road trip? And the last thing I will end on is that I think it's really important that you and your friends or family, you invite somebody to go and actually experience and enjoy the river, because nothing is going to make you want to protect and preserve it more than enjoying it and making connections with it. So without that desire to want to protect it, then we won't have the support to keep doing what we're doing. So yeah, go out and enjoy it. Celebrate
Awesome.
the
Well
river.
said. So there are some public events coming up to mark the centennial. And I'm just kind of curious, do you have any events, whether it's related to the centennial or not, that coming up this summer that you'd like to plug or mention?
We have our big event here at the La Crosse District is happening on June 22nd, and it will be at our visitor center here in Onalaska, Wisconsin. That will go from 10 to 2 with boat rides and partner activities and booths and some different talks and things like that. Should be pretty fun. And yes, there will be cake. It's a birthday party. The Savannah District is having their big celebration on June 8th, and that will be taking place out of their visitor contact station area. They're going to be doing tours to the Lost Mound unit, and they have a whole bunch of other activities planned through the day as well. There are a number of other things that are happening up and down the river. There are a lot of things that have already happened, but our partners have actually started a website to host a lot of those activities that aren't necessarily refuge specific, hosted by staff, because all of our partners are doing activities too. So, and that website is uppermiss100.com. So I recommend putting that in there, and then also putting our website as well for other activities.
Great. I'll put those in the show notes. Do you have social media accounts that are active that people can follow you at as well, or?
Yeah, we have the Refuge has a Facebook page. So we will put stuff there. We put a lot of stuff in Explore Lacrosse. Trying to think other platforms that we use for pushing stuff. But the Refuge specifically has our website and our Facebook page are our biggest tools for getting that out. And of course, news releases that will then be spread out to other resources.
Fantastic. Sabrina, Hallie, gosh, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the refuge. It's a fantastic place, and 3.5 million people visiting it already, so it's not really a secret. But I hope more people get out and explore the different nooks and crannies and really get to know the refuge well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Dean. We appreciate you helping us get the word out.
Thank you, Dean.
And now it's time for the Mississippi Minute. Well, this episode is all about heaping praise on our federal wildlife refuges. I know there are many other public lands along the Mississippi, many of which I mention in the Wild Mississippi. Shameless plug. But in this episode, I want to focus just on the refuges. And I recently pulled up a map of all of the federal refuges across the country just to make sure I wasn't missing any. But it's remarkable how many federal refuges line the Mississippi River or are very close to the Mississippi. And I'm not even looking at national forests or those kinds of public lands. These are just the federal refuges. So I just want to name a few of these. And just to be clear, we've already mentioned the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge as well as Trempealeau and Driftless Area NWRs. So the ones I'm about to talk about are in addition to those. In northern Minnesota, Crane Meadows National Wildlife Refuge is pretty close to the Mississippi, near St. Cloud. Port Louisa in Iowa is just south of Muscatine. Then in Missouri and Illinois, the Great River National Wildlife Refuge, Two Rivers National Wildlife Refuge, and the Middle Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge. All of them cover or include territory in both Missouri and Illinois. Continuing on south, we've got Reelfoot Lake. That is mostly in Tennessee, but includes a little bit of Kentucky as well. And then south of there, mostly on the Tennessee side, is the Chickasaw and Lower Hatchie National Wildlife Refuge. Across the river in Arkansas, the Wapanaka Refuge is just a couple miles away from the Mississippi, but certainly in the river's floodplain. In Mississippi, St. Catherine Creek. I had a great time hiking around that refuge a couple different times, including one year when I was jokingly calling one of the trails the Spider Trail because there were so many orb weavers that had built webs across the trail. Beautiful spiders. And then down in Louisiana, a couple of my favorite spots are Cat Island and Bayou Sauvage, the latter basically right on the edge of New Orleans. I'm wondering which refuges are your favorite spots? Which federal refuges in particular are your favorites along the Mississippi? Do you have a tip you'd like to share about visiting any of them? Any secret places you'd like us to know about, or semi-secret places? You can keep the secret ones to yourself. If you have something to share about any of these refuges, drop me a line at MississippiValleyTraveler.com/contact. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.